It was the kind of house you'd expect to see in a ghost story. Old, neglected, and steeped in mystery. The paint on the exterior was peeling, revealing the rotting wood beneath, and the windows, most of which were cracked, were obscured by thick layers of dust. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, standing like a forgotten monument to a time long past. But when I inherited it from a distant relative I'd never met, I found myself standing in front of it, keys in hand, ready to begin a new chapter of my life. I moved into the house during the dead of winter, the kind of winter where the chill seeps into your bones and the sun barely rises above the horizon. The snow had already begun to fall heavily, blanketing the ground in a thick white layer, making the world outside appear even more isolated than it already was. The house, despite its dilapidated state, had a strange sense of comfort to it. There was something welcoming about its creaky floorboards and crooked walls. I figured the isolation was a blessing. I had always preferred solitude, and the house offered me all the peace I could ask for. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, cleaning, and trying to bring some semblance of life back to the house. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. At night, I would hear noises, soft scratching like fingernails running down the walls. Sometimes, I could swear I heard footsteps, light and hesitant, pacing through the house when no one else was there. But when I would check, the house was always empty, just as I had left it. One evening, while cleaning the upstairs bedroom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a pair of fingerprints on the window pane. They were smudged, as though someone had pressed their fingers against the glass from the outside. But it was winter. The house had been closed up for years, and the snow that had fallen outside should have made it impossible for anyone to leave such a mark. I stared at the fingerprints for a long time, my mind racing with explanations. I had heard stories about the house, rumors that it had once belonged to a family that had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but an eerie silence. But I had dismissed those stories as nothing more than local gossip, the kind of tall tales people told to make the mundane more interesting. But now, standing in front of that window, I wasn't so sure. I wiped the glass with my sleeve, as though erasing the marks would erase whatever had left them. But when I stepped back, the fingerprints were still there. Only now, they were clearer, sharper, as if they had grown more defined in the time it took me to blink. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing. The house was not as empty as I had believed. That night, I went to bed uneasy. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. I tried to ignore the strange feeling gnawing at the back of my mind, but it was impossible. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. It was the kind of quiet that was suffocating, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. At exactly midnight, the scratching began again, this time louder and more persistent than ever. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from the window, just below where the fingerprints had been. I could hear the faint rustling, as though someone or something was dragging its nails along the glass. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though whoever or whatever was on the other side of the window was desperate to get inside. I felt the weight of their presence pressing against me, suffocating me with their need to be close, to be acknowledged. My mind screamed for me to run, to leave, but my body was paralyzed, trapped by a fear I couldn't escape. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. I didn't dare look out the window. I couldn't. But in the morning, I went down to check. The snow outside had stopped falling, leaving behind a pristine, untouched blanket of white. The air was still, the world outside eerily silent. But there, on the window pane, were the fingerprints again, clearer this time, as if they had been left just moments ago. And this time, they weren't just fingerprints. They were fingers. Long, bony fingers, their tips pressing firmly into the glass. The marks were too distinct to be mistaken for anything else. The fingers seemed to stretch across the entire window pane, as though someone had been trying to claw their way inside. There was no sign of anyone outside, no tracks in the snow, nothing that could explain how they had come to be there. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to run far away from the house and never look back. But there was a part of me, some dark, twisted part, that couldn't pull myself away. I had to know what was going on, what was happening in that house. That night, the scratching returned. But this time, I was ready. I stood by the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the entire house was shaking with the force of it. I could feel something pressing against the glass, a weight, a presence, something desperate clawing to get in. I stepped back from the window, terrified, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. That's when I saw it, something moving in the shadows outside. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I saw them. The fingers. They were still there, longer now, stretching farther across the glass. But this time, they weren't just outside, they were moving. They began to tap, to drum against the glass, as if beckoning me. My pulse quickened. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer, but the thought of leaving, of stepping into the darkness outside, was more terrifying than anything I could imagine. Suddenly, the fingers stopped moving. The tapping ceased. The silence was unbearable, and it stretched on for what felt like an eternity. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it, a whisper. It was soft at first, like the wind, but then it grew louder, clearer. It was coming from the window, from the fingers themselves. "Let me in." I turned around, but the window was empty. The fingers were gone. The house was silent once more, but I could feel the presence lingering, just beyond my reach, watching, and the whispering never stopped. From that day on, the fingers remained a constant fixture on the window pane, their presence haunting me every night. And though I never saw the person or thing behind them again, I could always feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And I knew they were never going to let me leave.